Roxo Media House.
A Signal 51 is police code for an investigation, a law enforcement proceeding that is a systemic and thorough attempt to learn the facts about a possible crime that is complex and whose facts and circumstances are generally hidden, at least initially, behind obstacles that can be coincidental and or man-made. Investigations methods are formal. I'm John Henry, a journalist. My partner is Jake White, a retired Fort Worth police sergeant. And together we examine the difficult cases of law enforcement, both in Fort Worth and around the region. This is Signal 51. The show is designed specifically for a more mature audience. Some of the content is graphic and is not intended for younger audiences. From the Roxo Media House studios in Fort Worth, this is the Signal 51 Chronicles. I'm John Henry with co-host Jake White, retired sergeant of the Fort Worth Police Department. This is episode 6, Fort Worth, Outlaw Country. We begin today in what seems to be a crime epidemic in Fort Worth. Crime here and beyond seems out of control. On a daily basis, we open the newspaper or news app and read about a shooting here, a murder there. Just last night, we had 4 shootings and a murder, and a myriad of violent crime in between. It's not just media looking for online traffic either, or viewers on cable news networks. According to annual crime reports put together by the Fort Worth Police Department, the year 2015 ended with 61 murders. 6 years later, at the end of 2021, the city recorded an eye-popping 122 homicides, a 100% increase. A dramatic spike in violent crime is not unique to Fort Worth either. It seems as if it is everywhere. The reasons why include prolific violent offenders being released on little to no bond amounts. That is happening. Understaffed and demoralized police departments, paralyzed by society's political tumult and disorder is another. We have seen crime spikes in our lifetime. The late 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic spurred the name Murder Worth for our fine city, and I'm sure other big cities had similar comparisons. If we stay at the current pace, the Murder Worth name will return to relevance. However, as we dive into this next story, I think we're going to see that this idea of violent crime is not a new concept. This idea of gangs feuding over drugs and whatever underworld activity they're involved in is a petri dish for violence and more and even greater societal disorder. Ideally, the police and community working together can quell the unrest. But the past can teach us something about our present and give us a glimpse into the future. A multi-layered story of the criminal underworld in Fort Worth in the 1950s, with more plot lines than a city has potholes, provides valuable lessons to today. It all started with the wounding of an innocent 14-year-old girl, caught in the worst place at the very worst time, trying to get her dog out of the middle of gunfire between rival gangs in an East Fort Worth neighborhood. The hours leading up to 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, August 21st, 1958, had been quite pleasant actually for a late summer day in Fort Worth. The thunderstorm was intermixed with light rain and drizzle. By the late afternoon, however, the precipitation had moved on. Bobby Ray Foote and Johnny Green had gotten out that day in the neighborhood of Polytechnic Heights. Polytechnic was an established neighborhood in the 1950s. It had been founded in the early 1850s by a pair of families from Tennessee. In 1890, the Methodist Episcopal Church South founded Polytechnic College on hilltop land donated by those same families, the Tandys and the Hills. Today, that university is Texas Wesleyan, sitting on the same site. At one time, Polytechnic Heights was an incorporated city with a stop on the Fort Worth interurban. It was a city and community in every sense of the word, with a post office and fire station and even the first world amenities like a movie theater and ice cream shop and more. The city of Fort Worth incorporated Polytechnic into its city limits during the 1920s. What Foote and Green were up to that day, there was no telling. But at 3:30, as Foote drove northbound in the 1800 block of Arch Street, a tempest of bullets came storming into the car. A man driving the other car traveling southbound had forced the car Foote was driving to stop. The man then jumped out and began to fire indiscriminately into Foote's vehicle. 2 of those bullets blasted into Bobby Ray Foote's stomach and back. Foote, seriously wounded, attempted to make his way back home, but collapsed and died in the front yard of 4101 Avenue L. At the very young age of 26, Bobby Ray Foote had been gunned down, and he was merely 2 blocks from his home. Witnesses reported to police that at least 15 gunshots were fired. The assailants fled. So too did Johnny Green, Foote's passenger, who had no intention of waiting around for the investigation to begin. Fort Worth police opened a Signal 51. This investigation now involving a homicide. Detectives Grady Hare and A.C. Howerton were called to the scene. Hare, known to colleagues as the gentleman's detective, he dressed like a banker or undertaker and carried himself with the dignity of a preacher, made an immediate connection to the case, to the shooting a week before in the same neighborhood. The week prior, 14-year-old Carol Ann Pettigrew was in the wrong place at the very worst time when caught in the middle of an ambush. She was seriously injured after being peppered by shotgun pellets in an alley near her home. Young Carol, who was trying to get her dog out of the way of the attack, had been an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of gangsters who cared not a bit who was hurt in their pursuit of ill-gotten gains, according to police. One of those gangsters was Bobby Ray Foote. Foote was in the midst of a feud with a rival gang to control the underworld vice trade in Fort Worth. In news reports of that day, Detective Howerton described them as procurers and keepers of women for the purpose of prostitution. In the shooting that wounded Pettigrew, she was the only wounded person in the incident. Foote and his compadres were the ones who launched the attack, police said. Jake White, let's bring you into this here a little bit. How do police so quickly go about making a determination that Foote's death was related to that shooting the week before?
So first, I think you have to look at the fact that crime often has geographical connections. And what I mean by this, the criminal element typically does not stray far from where they sleep. That's the way it was then, and that's the way it is today. Second, violent crime and violent offenders stand out. They did in 1958, and they do in 2022. For example, a shooting in Fort Worth today is common, perhaps daily or close to daily. So it's difficult for investigators to isolate suspects unless the victim has a known enemy. However, in 1958, a shooting where someone was killed was not as common. Therefore, police are going to immediately begin to research the actors who are capable of such violence or focus on known enemies. In the case of Bobby Ray Foote, focusing on known enemies would be a list 1 mile long.
And that list would be a mile long because by then, Foote was a central figure in the criminal underworld in Fort Worth.
Bobby Ray Foote was no saint. The first page of a lengthy rap sheet, especially for such a short life, began as a 17-year-old. Foote, a Fort Worth native, born in 1932, was sentenced to 5 years probation on an assault charge in an alleged robbery attempt of a seminary student. The robbery charge was dismissed, but the assault charge stuck. 3 years later, he again found himself the subject of a criminal investigation, charged as a suspect in a series of burglaries. However, a Tarrant County grand jury no-billed him. 1 month later, Foote turns up in Missouri, wounded by Missouri State Police after he and 2 companions fled after being stopped. In the car, which authorities discovered had been stolen, police found liquor swiped from a Sedalia, Missouri liquor store. Foote, his right arm shattered by the rifle fire, pleaded guilty to auto theft and was assessed a 2-year sentence in the Missouri prison.
Fort Worth has a notorious history with underworld crime figures, linked mostly to gambling and prostitution, certainly in those days. Bonnie and Clyde's infamous string of bad deeds included the Easter Sunday murder of State Trooper H.D. Murphy and Edward Wheeler in Grapevine. In January 1933, about a year before, Clyde killed Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis in Dallas. Deputy Davis, future Tarrant County Sheriff Dusty Rhodes, Walter Evans, and another investigator with the District Attorney's Office, along with sheriff's deputies from Dallas County and a member of the Texas Rangers, surrounded a house in West Dallas looking for someone else, Odell Chambliss, who was wanted in the robbery of Home Bank in Grapevine. The crew of law enforcement went to the house earlier in the evening. There they found only 17-year-old Margie Ferris and 2 children. So outside they sat and waited in hiding. Around midnight, a car stopped in front of the house. A man got out armed with a shotgun and pistol. At the officer's command, Ferris opened the door. She also is said to have yelled to Barrow that authorities were at the house. Davis and another deputy, posted in the back, ran to the front as the gunman began to flee. As Davis ordered him to stop, the gunman fired point blank with the shotgun, striking Davis in the stomach. It is certain that my deputy was killed by a gunman member of some gang of outlaws, Tarrant County Sheriff J.R. Red Wright said. All facts and circumstances bear out that theory. As it turned out, the other gangster with Bonnie and Clyde that night was a young kid, William Daniel Jones, then only 17 at the time. The duel outside the White Elephant Saloon between gambler Luke Short and then former Fort Worth Marshal Jim Courtright is legendary. Courtright's legacy is mixed at best. He indeed did some good things as a law enforcement agent here, but he got in his share of legal scrapes as well, including wanted for as many as 14 murders in New Mexico, according to a book authored by Fort Worth historian Richard Seltzer. Quote-unquote money manners were at the heart of the dispute between Short and Courtright. In reality, Courtright was trying to extort Short at the time of the duel, which really was no duel at all. Short emptied his pistol into his doomed challenger, a drunken doomed challenger at that. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made a trip through here. We have as proof a famous photo taken. But one of the more infamous cases involved a man named Jeff Daggett, a sad sack of humanity if there ever was one. Jeff Daggett was another troubled soul, a product of an unwanted mixed-race pregnancy. His mother was a slave, and his father was the son of E.M. Daggett, the so-called father of Fort Worth. Jeff Daggett was bad news his whole life, from his unwelcome birth in 1863 to his unfortunate end 54 years later in a hail of bullets in the Tarrant County Courthouse, Seltzer wrote. Rejected by his white paternal family, Daggett found a home in the underworld as a gambler and owner of a saloon in Hell's Half Acre, a saloon that catered to African Americans. Time and again, he was accused of assault and murder, once even going to Huntsville, the state penitentiary, for the murder of a man named Dick Van. Van was another gambler who was shot and killed in 1892. Daggett was ultimately killed in 1917 by County Detective Ben Leggett at the Tarrant County Courthouse. Daggett was supposedly going there to file a complaint against Leggett for an incident at a saloon. Leggett and others allegedly heard Daggett say he was there to cause Leggett harm. Those are just a few of a long list of notorious characters who either made a stop in Fort Worth or made a home here. Now, Jake, you've seen your share of gangs and gang activity in your more than 20-year career in Fort Worth. We hear about them all the time. What do they look like in Fort Worth?
Right now, it's an issue. It's an issue of serious concern. Fort Worth's never been one of the cities where gangs have been well organized. And what I mean by that, they didn't often have those formal leaders, if you will, the ones with a title, the ones who controlled the gang activity. But today what we're seeing, gangs are getting younger, 13, 14, 15 years old. They're getting violent, shooting after shooting. In fact, 2 weeks ago, a shooting at a local grocery store, suspect, 13-year-old male.
13 years old.
Yep. Charged with murder. The other thing that's happening, they're becoming fractured. There's more of them. Although they may claim allegiance to one particular gang, your notorious Crips and Bloods type gangs, there's many, many, many little subsets now. Mm-hmm. And they're everywhere. Every side of town. And the crimes that they're involved in, robberies, murders, drugs, and the list goes on. The firepower that they have now. Stopping a car with a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 17-year-old and pulling out an SKS or an AK-47 is not uncommon. So when we do this comparison and contrast to a story from 1958 to 2022, we can see that gangs have always been an issue. But frankly, here we are some 70 years later, 60, 70 years later, and the problem still persists. There has been no effective solution as a whole. Now, in the early 90s, gang crime was at an all-time high. I think we can all remember that. We can all remember the news stories. One thing that worked were strict prison sentences. And it's unfortunate that that's the solution. It's unfortunate that the solution is 99 years in prison or something thereabouts.
Which was a sentence that one young guy just got recently.
Yep. A gang member in Fort Worth for a robbery.
Yeah.
If there was another avenue, another approach, something else that worked, by all means, let's use it. But frankly, the only thing that we know that works at this point is to incarcerate violent offenders and incarcerate them for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. It has an impact. It works.
And there's a reason that it's still around, this gang activity and the proliferation of gang activity. It's because the reasons socially are much greater than one police department or community. And one of these days we'll figure that out. But, or maybe we won't. I don't know. Let's get back to the Foote case.
Yeah. So in the shooting of Foote, remember Fort Worth, 1958, we're talking about a city that's roughly 325,000 people, a much smaller police department. It was structured differently. Often the officers would ride in what we called a two-man unit, still call them that to this date. It's basically where you have two officers in the car. Mm-hmm.
Like your Adam 12 looking, yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that the department got away from. We don't see it as often, but essentially what that creates is there's fewer patrol cars on the street. Okay. So we got a smaller police department, a smaller city. Technology obviously is nowhere where it is today. So called to assist Detective Hare and Detective Howerton were the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers, to us locally, have that legendary name. We all know who they are. We all have this vision in our mind. But outside of Texas, maybe that's not the case. So the Texas Rangers, according to the Department of Public Safety website, is the primary criminal investigative branch of the Texas Department of Public Safety.
One riot, one ranger.
I believe that's correct.
Yes.
So in this Foote case, we knew that there were 15 shots fired according to witnesses. Who fired the 15 shots initially was unknown. The preliminary investigative steps revealed, though, the occupants in the southbound vehicle, that vehicle that forced Foote's car to stop, were not the only shooters. Foote himself had managed to fire at least one round while or shortly after being shot. When investigators searched Foote's vehicle, they located a shotgun under the seat where he was sitting in the vehicle. A little more than 1 month after Foote was shot and killed, the grand jury convened and handed up indictments in Foote's death.
The state of Texas would bring Garrett Milton Ramsey Donald Kenneth Gant and Larry Wade Gasulis to face charges in the death of Foote. Missing from the grand jury proceedings was Johnny Green, who fled Fort Worth for the Bay Area in California. Next week, join us for Episode 7, Part 2 of Fort Worth, Outlaw Country.
Roxo Media House.